A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroying those murderers, and he burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him out into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. So here we are in this 19th week of listening to Jesus teach us about what it means to be in the kingdom of God, to live in this kingdom that he came to inaugurate through his life, his works, his death, his resurrection. And we have another parable today, and we get another example of this beautiful dance between Matthew and Isaiah. Isaiah, surprisingly, is referenced by Matthew a lot in his gospel because Matthew was writing primarily to Jews to try to invite them, to encourage them to be followers of Jesus. And so last week, we heard that parable about the vineyard owner and those who had forfeited the vineyard because they didn't give to God what was God's, or didn't give to the owner the due to the owner. And so Matthew's using that as a way to say to those Pharisees, look, you haven't acted well up till now, but you got another chance. And so this week, we have the portion of Matthew right after that where another story is presented to invite these Pharisees, the leaders of the Jewish people who had reformed, to come and be a part of Matthew's community, the followers of Jesus the Christ. So that's a little bit of the dynamic that's going on today. But let's realize that what we take from these readings today is going to be influenced a lot by how you see yourself in these stories. Are you one of the slaves? Are you one of Isaiah's community? Are you one of Matthew's community? Are you invited to the wedding banquet? Are you one of the people of Jerusalem? So let's visit these a little bit and just see what they're offering us as a message for our lives today. So Isaiah, prophet Isaiah, is writing in about 630 BC, so a full 600 years before Jesus. And he's writing to a people who are living in Jerusalem, but they have been impoverished by the Assyrian Empire. Now, the Assyrians were living in what would be modern-day Iraq. They were the empire of the 7th century, and they had come across Syria and had taken over northern Israel. And they had scattered the people, and they had taken over that land and those vineyards. And Isaiah earlier was telling us that happened because of their lack of fidelity to the covenant with God. And a foreign power came in to teach them a lesson. And they were scattered. But what the people of Jerusalem found is they were allowed to survive as long as they paid great tribute to the king of Assyria. And it impoverished them. I mean, you can imagine 60 or 70% of what they grew and built and earned went to furnish and to support a foreign government. And what they started to see was cities building up across the valley from Jerusalem. So they've got their city of Jerusalem fortified where the Jews are living, and they look across the valley, and the Assyrians are building cities with their money. I mean, it would be like if we climbed to the roof of St. Paul Church and looked across the highway and saw a city being built over there that all of our money was going to support the building of. But they weren't people that we knew. And there would be a certain level of fear there, wouldn't there? There would be a sense of resentment and anger about that. And the people of Jerusalem felt that deeply about the Assyrians. And they began to wonder, has our God abandoned us? Are the gods of the Assyrians really stronger? Are they better? Are they going to win? And as that kind of language, those thoughts are filling their heads and their mouths, suddenly something happens. And they don't know why, but those Assyrian cities start to crumble. And that's what we hear Isaiah talk about today. Those fortified cities are led to destruction. And they don't know why, but they're left in this place of wonderment. What's going on? Well, we know now the Babylonians had destroyed Nineveh and were taking over the empire and were wiping out the Assyrian empire. But the Jerusalemites were wondering what was going on. And so Isaiah says, all I know is that God is swallowing up death. Because the people of Jerusalem associated death with the Assyrians. They were taking their livelihood. They were keeping them from fulfillment and joy. And all of a sudden, there's a new opportunity. And Isaiah says, this is our God, our faithful God, swallowing up death. And in its place will be the victorious king, our God. And what they did in those days was whenever a king would plunder or take over another people's, they would throw a great banquet for his own people with the spoils, right? And so Isaiah says, how do I lift the hearts of these Jerusalemites, of these Jews who have suffered for years now with lack of food and lack of opportunity and fear? How do I lift their hearts? I know I will speak of the banquet our God will bring for us, that our God has promised for us as a victorian king. Now, I don't know about you. When you think about a banquet, what comes to mind? Yeah, food. Do you associate it with a holiday or a gathering? Like maybe Thanksgiving or Christmas, and you think about extended family, and you think about getting together maybe at grandma's house or mom's house, and you walk in and, well, I mean, Lutheran potlucks approximate this, right? You know, there's tables and tables of food, and it seems like there's way more food than anybody could ever eat. That's what Isaiah is describing in this. And I had the privilege of being invited to one of these kinds of meals when I lived in Israel in 1992. I didn't go, and these meals would last for 8 days. That's what was significant about this. They would party, they would have the banquet with all this abundance through a whole creation cycle plus one. It's their way of saying, our God reigns. Life reigns. Why? Because we go through creation and that day of fasting, that day of rest, that day of acknowledging who God is, and then we have another day to celebrate life all over again. It's the Paschal mystery in a banquet. It is the suffering. We go through the death, but we raise to new life. They celebrate it in their banquets. And so when I lived in Israel, I got to go to one day of an 8-day celebration. But when I walked in, it was a hall like this, and every table was covered with food, falafel and eggs and olives and tabbouleh and hummus and and then there was the roasted lamb and the goat. Now, you hear Isaiah refer to the banquet that those people are promised is one with rich wines, well-aged wines, because that was the fortification of their diet. They didn't drink the water. It was too dangerous. Wine had aged, but it all had sediment in it, and it wasn't very good. So if you got strained wine that was aged for a long time, that was a sign of wealth. That was a sign of privilege. And if you got meat, that's the sign of wealth. And he describes this banquet as the marrow. Who usually gets the marrow? Have any of you ever eaten bone marrow? Osobuco? What's it taste like? Oh gosh, it's like butter. It melts in your mouth. And he says, you know what? Not only the king's going to get the marrow, and not only the royal court's going to get the marrow, everybody's going to get the marrow. That's how great this feast is going to be. That's how the surplus of wealth our God is going to share with us when the city of Jerusalem is reestablished as God's city. Our God is faithful. Our God has swallowed up death, and the banquet will be tremendous. And we hear at the end of that, as Virginia reminded us, they say to us, our God indeed has saved us. Let us be glad and rejoice. That's hard for people who have been under siege, who have been cut off, who have been suffering, to suddenly rejoice. And yet that's what they were moved to by Isaiah's image. So where's the banquet in your life today? Matthew borrows this image and applies it a little bit differently. Remember last week we talked about Isaiah was talking about the people as the grapes, and Matthew was talking to the Pharisees, the leadership. Similarly, this week, Isaiah is talking about the people of Jerusalem, and Matthew's going to borrow the image to talk about the leadership and what's happened in his day. Remember, Matthew's writing in about 50 years after Jesus. But he uses Jesus and Jesus' stories to teach something to his own people. And what we know is that they're in this conflict with the leaders of the Jews. Who's really the new Israel? Who's God's favorite? Who's God's church? Who's got God's authority? Where's the power of God being manifest? And Matthew uses these examples to say, look, we are the new Israel. And this parable this week, right in the face of the Pharisees again, he says to them, you know, God, our victorious God, is going to throw a banquet. It's a wedding feast for his son. Now they all know the Son of God, according to the Christians, according to Matthew's community, the Jews killed him. The Pharisees were part of killing him 50 years earlier. They all know that. But what do the Christians proclaim? What does Matthew's community proclaim? Death was swallowed up by the cross. Resurrection overcame death. There's no reason for us to fear anymore. And our God is going to throw a banquet. And the banquet is going to be in our community. It's happening every Sunday. We have the banquet of our God that celebrates life through Jesus the Christ. And he says, you know, the invitation went out to you, Pharisees and Jews. The invitation's there. Many of you have said no. Many of you are going back to what you knew. Many of you are being hostile to the prophets. Many of you are killing Christians. The invitation is there. But God, we have to be careful not to take this too literally. This is a story that's meant to make a point. Either Christianity is ultimately important or it means nothing. And Matthew is saying, look, your denial of Jesus the Christ has led to the destruction of Jerusalem. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70. And that is the city being destroyed. That's the kingdom being taken away from the Jews. But he's saying, come join us. We will recreate the kingdom. The banquet is here. Come join us. And when the slaves go out to invite them to the banquet, what do they take with them? A robe, a wedding robe, a baptismal robe. For Matthew's community, the invitation is received when people say yes to Jesus the Christ, and they put on the robe in the waters of baptism. And so how do the Christians recognize each other? They're all wearing white robes, just like all of you are today. Oh, we've kind of lost that tradition, but it applies to us. All of us who have passed through the waters of baptism are wearing the wedding robe. Whose wedding is it? The wedding of the Lamb. Right? We hear John pick that up. And so it's important to wear the robe. Matthew is saying we recognize in each other that we are changed. We're different. We wear the wedding robe because we're in the feast. We're in the joy. We're in the abundance of our God. And then we have this little tidbit in here that's kind of provocative. There's this guy who's there without a robe on. And it seems like he gets punished pretty harshly. But again, what Matthew is suggesting is, look, you Jews who show up and want to enjoy the banquet without saying yes to Christ, you're a marauder. You don't understand what you're doing. You're taking from the feast, and it's about you. It's not about Christ anymore. It's about you. You just want to participate without the yes. And we know as Christians, we can't participate in the banquet without the yes. The yes matters. To wear this robe matters. What we do as Christians in the world matters. It has to, or the world will remain in darkness, in gnashing of teeth, in lostness. But that's not the promise of those of us who live in the shadow of the cross, those of us who live in the joy of the resurrection and the banquet of our God. We are sent wearing our wedding robes into the world to invite all into the banquet, to give people the opportunity to say the yes. Here's your robe. Come, join us. Enjoy the banquet. It matters. And truly in that, as the body of Christ, we can rejoice knowing that our God has visited us, that our God has given us salvation, the robe of grace to bring into all of those situations, visiting the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous, the wicked and the law followers. They're all invited. They're all around us. It might leave us a little uncomfortable. We don't want to be in the banquet with people who we don't think are good. The Pharisees didn't want to think that the people who didn't follow the law well enough were a part of God's promise. But in the Christian community, the law leads us to Christ. The gospel is what brings us together. The gospel is what continues to feed us. The gospel is freedom. You're not responsible for me and my salvation, and I'm not responsible for you. Why? Because Christ already did it, right? Salvation is here. The banquet is before us. What we're invited to do is to trust, to say yes, and to enjoy the banquet. And so today, we will enjoy a foretaste of the banquet. This bread and this wine will remind us of what God has in store for us today and through our lives and for eternity, the banquet of our God.